So thanks so much for re-inviting me again and giving me the opportunity to be here. It's a pleasure to be with you guys and a pleasure to be to talk in this summer school. I mean, I heard about it. I mean, it's a great place. So congratulations also to all students who are here. As you probably know, my area of expertise is demand modeling. So I know that here is kind of diverse background. You students, work in different fields, etc. And you have had in this summer school quite diverse presentations. So I think this one will be the two presentations I'm going to give you yet something different from what you have seen so far. So my first presentation is forecasting the diffusion of autonomous vehicles. The title, the presentation will be a little bit more generic, not only specific about autonomous vehicle, and you will see why I'm saying that. Okay, no, this. Did I post the record?
Yeah, I would.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, if we think about the transport system now, we do have lots of innovation, lots of new technology that are entering in the society, in the transport system. And when we talk about innovation, we probably think, well, yes, definitely autonomous vehicles, aerial vehicles, that's the most innovative things we have at the moment. But also electric vehicles, they are still something that can be considered an innovation. And the same for other systems like mobility as a service. I mean, when I say, well, this is not innovative, why, that? But innovation in general is anything, any product, an idea, etc., that people perceive as something new for them. So it's more about, it's not like technologically how innovative is something, but how people perceive the system or the product, whether this is something new for them, they know about it, they know how to use it, etc., or not. When we talk about at least some of this innovation, we know that government have spent lots of money trying to boost the technology and try to also get people, the technology into the system so people can use them. And they did all this because they anticipated, huge benefit. So if we look at some paper, for example, regarding on autonomous vehicles, and there are famous paper in 2014, Kara Cockerman, et cetera, I'd say, well, with autonomous vehicle, we can get, lots of benefits in terms of reduction of pollution, in terms of parking space, commuting time, et cetera. And so based on this idea, the government decided also to put lots of money on that. All this benefit, most of the paper on this area, they are based on the use of autonomous vehicle as a shared system. So not only as autonomous vehicle as own vehicles. So if we look at private owned vehicles, there are much less papers, but still there are papers that have computed the benefit in parking time. That's absolutely probably the most important benefit. Benefit because people with limited mobility can use, can continue to have accessibility to activities, services, etc. Their benefit on safety, of course, depends, especially if they are connected, etc. We need to be careful, of course, because there might be also a counter effect that the most important is, if we are not careful, also shift between sustainable modes, public transport, to autonomous vehicle, and this means more people using private cars instead of using sustainable mobility. But in general, whatever are these numbers, and of course there is some uncertainty around these numbers. We will see also why there is this. It's so difficult, to give numbers that, especially for autonomous vehicles, that are with some precision, I would say. all these benefits, we can get this benefit only if we have people using the system. So deep down, the question we have to ask is, under which condition people will adopt the technology and under which condition people will use the technology. And this comes to the title of this presentation, which is how we do forecast the demand for innovation. And for those who have worked on the demand, forecasting demand for transport, but in general for any product, but in particular for transport, is really challenging. And this is not only when we talk about innovation, this is challenging even when we talk about transport systems that have been with us forever. So it's a challenging task, much more challenging than estimating the models. So estimating the models is complicated, but using the model to forecast the demand is an extra layer of complexity. Recently, with a PhD student, former PhD students of mine, he did a literature review on electric vehicles. As I said, electric vehicles are still perceived by individuals as innovative. And then he analyzed papers that have tried to forecast the demand. And he did a very systematic job, a very interesting job. And he found that all papers, they have overestimated the adoption of the electric vehicles. So the diffusion, the adoption of the vehicles is much lower than any paper had anticipated when they use models to try to forecast the demand. And the demand we have now is basically corresponds to what in those paper was considered the worst scenario. So if the conditions are like the worst possible, no incentives, no recharging, etc., this is the demand forecasted and the demand in those paper and the demand that we see now. So the demand we have now corresponds to the worst scenarios in those papers. If we look at autonomous vehicle, we cannot compare that much because, of course, autonomous vehicles are not yet with us. But again, there are papers who try to forecast the demand, and all papers in the past, they forecast that by now we should have many more autonomous vehicles than we actually have. So again, all the forecasts have been a little bit over-optimistic. So the question that is a practical question, but of course also a research question, which is interesting, at least for those like me who work in this field, is why it is so challenging to forecast the demand. Well, there are many reasons, of course. One reason is that when we take decision in transport, there are so many factors that affect our decision. So it's not only the technical aspect. So, like for example, the product we offer, travel time, cost, waiting time, etc. But if you think about the decision we take in our life, they are affected by everything basically that is around us. So every people we meet, the society we grew up, etc. And so everything that we hear about, the news, they are so important in how we take decision. And we don't realize sometimes how much they shape our decision, but they do. And take into consideration all this effect is definitely quite challenging. And when we look at new technology, innovation, there are only two elements of challenge. One is that the technology very often is not ready. It's still an evolving phase. If you think about electric vehicles 10 years ago and the electric vehicles now, you can appreciate how much the technology has improved. Think about the autonomy of an electric vehicle. In the past was the most important element, and now the range has increased enough, so it's like much better. So it's difficult for us to anticipate what will be the technology, how much will advance in a certain number of years. So we need that technology to make forecasts, but we don't know. So there is another level of uncertainty around that. And the second element is user preference. So we know that demand depends on the characteristics of, for example, the product, but also how important each characteristics is for individuals. And this is preference in a very, common term that we use to express that. It's not exactly precise, but let's say we call it preferences. And we know that preference, they change, so, and preference forms over time. So it's very difficult for a product that do not exist to measure what could be the preference of people have for that product. And then we will see a little bit more later about that. In a work I've done with another PhD students of mine on autonomous vehicles, we ask people how familiar you are. We interview lots of people in different countries, in the UK, in Toronto, and also in China. And we asked, the survey was much more complex, but the first question we asked to set the scene was, how familiar are you with the 5 level of automation of autonomous vehicles? And as you can see from here, there are lots of people who are not familiar at all. Those very familiar, there are very few. And there are people who are like slightly have heard in the newspaper, they exist, etc. You see China, the green bar, there seems to be a little bit more towards like they know more. But actually, the reason for that result is that in China, we conducted the survey in different cities. And in particular, we also try to interview people who have used autonomous vehicles in the cities where the autonomous vehicle, the taxi, was operating. And of course, if you see the answers, the distribution of answers for these kind of people, those who are very familiar in China, of course, there are those who have used the autonomous taxi. That makes sense. So on average, because in the UK and in Toronto, they have some pilots, but they're not like the service is not there. So if you only consider those cities in China where the service is not there or people have not used the taxi, the distribution is similar. But of course, in China, you also have cities where the taxi is operating, so there are people who have used that. So going back to how to forecast the demand, so there are, on top of the normal objective characteristics, which are the characteristics of the product, there are 2 elements at least we need to consider. One is the social dimension. So how important is the society around us and how we interact with the society in the diffusion of an innovation, and then how we calculate the preference. In this presentation now, I will focus on the first part, the social dimension, and the next presentation will be more about how can we measure preferences for alternatives that actually do not exist. So we said we have 2 elements. Normally when we try to forecast demand for innovation, one is the diffusion effect, and the other one we can call substitution effect. The diffusion effect, the diffusion theory, is something that goes back to Roger. He formulated the theory in 1962 for agriculture products, so something like completely different. But it became like a point of reference theory for any kind of innovation. So every time the diffusion of innovation has been forecasted, that's the theory that has been used so far. And basically the theory says that the majority of people, especially when an innovation appears, do not really evaluate the alternative of the innovation based on the objective factor, the characteristics, but they look more at what other people around them they have done. So they try to, they rely on those who have already had experience. So there are an initial group of people who decide to use the innovation, and then the rest of people basically follow them. And this theory has been then formalized in the 1969 by this famous model by Bass. that basically reproduce this. I mean, there is a term who's an innovator, those who start like using the technology, and then the other one are imitators. They follow, you know, and so the bigger is the number of people who started, the more you know, you copy them, the more you have people around you that might affect what influence your decision. And so the typical curve is this kind of exponential curve that you see there. So one of these graph is for electric vehicles, and this is the real market. So this is the diffusion of the number of vehicles sold in these years. And the other one is for autonomous vehicle, and it is a prediction. So as I said, to predict the diffusion of innovation, very often this is the theory used, and this follow this theory. The problem is that to build this curve, we need to know what is the coefficient of imitator and coefficient of innovators, and there's no way we can calculate them if the demand is not there. So the only things we can do, and what they did, is like we take the coefficient estimated for some other demand, and we assume there will be the same shape, and then we calculate that. So for example, sometimes they use the coefficient, you know, for a microwave, you know, and they use the same coefficient to forecast the demands of another product. And this will not work exactly in the same way. So I mean, it's easy to overestimate the demand using this kind of aggregate model. On the other hand, the substitution model is like, I don't know if those who are familiar with discrete choice model, but basically the theory is more economic theory, says people compare attributes. They compare alternatives, and they look at the characteristics of each alternative, and they choose the alternative that give them the highest satisfaction. And this is a basic theory behind the substitution model. Now, if you think about the electric vehicles, we say, oh, I do have hot. That's here. Do I need to? Yeah. So if you look at the electric vehicle market, we said that if you look at this vehicle sold, the curve is like this very nice, you know, exponential curve. But the vehicles sold, electric vehicles sold, are only 18% of the total vehicles sold worldwide, which means that the other, the majority are still internal combustion vehicles. And this tells us that there is a substitution. So, you know, people still now, when they go to buy a car, they still substitute between electric vehicles and gasoline cars. So if you have to predict the demand and you look at this number, what you think is like, well, I cannot use only the diffusion theory, because it's not only the electric vehicle are not the predominant vehicle. The people still make a substitution between new innovation and old. So, and this is actually what's happened. So, even if you look at the 5 characteristics in the diffusion theory that need to be there for diffusion to be successful, the first one is relative advantage. So, relative advantage means that the product, the innovation is considered better compared to the tradition, the other one. So if you look at the electric vehicles, and if you think that it's only 80%, buying electric vehicles, it means that there are still lots of people who do not consider electric vehicle better than another, that the internal combustion, so they still buy internal combustion vehicles. So one of the first characteristics of the diffusion to happen is already fails, because there's not this relative advantage. People do not consider electric vehicle in this way. Another characteristic is compatibility. We will talk about this a little bit more later. And basically, it's as if the innovation is perceived as consistent with your need. So it allows you to satisfy the need you have. And as I said, we will talk a little bit more later. The alternative need to be, the innovation need to be considered easy to use. And so, for example, there are lots of studies on autonomous vehicle. They are trying to measure the perceived ease of use. So there are still people, normally people consider not too difficult. So, I mean, it's an important variable has been found, but not for autonomous vehicle, the most important limitation for using that. Back then, if you think about electric vehicles, I mean, if you think it's like, oh, they're very similar, you know, why they are so different from normal vehicles. But still, there were lots of people who, for example, were scared about the need to change the activity plan, the daily activity pattern. So in our life, we have life organized in a certain way. We do chain of activities. So with electric vehicles, because you had to recharge more often, one of the things people felt was complex to move to electric vehicles is because they have to change their life. They have to rethink about the plan, the activity plan. So the schedule. I need to go to work. I leave my kids to school. Then I go to another. And then, you know, with a normal car, with a gasoline car, I can do all this. With an electric vehicles, I might not be able to do that. So I need to rethink about. So sometimes the perception of something easy to use or not is not related to the technology of the car, but more how this affect our life in general. There is a problem of there's trialability and other characteristics, and this is also the reason why, if you see worldwide, there are lots of pilots. You know, especially for autonomous vehicles, back then also for electric vehicles. And there are two reasons for that. We test the technology, but also we allow people to experience the technology. Here there are two caveats we need to be careful about. For example, for autonomous vehicles, there are lots of trials that are, I would say, not, I'm not saying the word realistic is not correct, but you have the experience, but you have the experience for a trip that is not how you would use the vehicle in everyday life. And so it's different. So, you know, I try myself, for example, in the UK, there was a trial with a small bus. And it was super nice. You know, the car was super fancy, etc. But it was like holiday, you know, like it's not like the experience of using that system everyday life for my trip to work or to activities. So it's a kind of different. So people might report they're happy with the system in that experience, but that does not translate necessarily to use the system in everyday life. So when you have to say, well, shall I buy or shall I use this bus? That's completely different because it's for a different activity in my day life, etc. So again, trials are super important, but sometimes we need to be careful to reach conclusion from this trial because it depends on how the trial is. And there is another caveat which is super important, that is because our preferences are formed based on experience. If the experience is not good, that can jeopardize, you know, the demand. Because I have a bad experience, and we know, and I also did some work on that and tested, you know, in survey and modeling, etc. That if people have a bad experience with a product, then they use even less, and it takes even more time to go back. And this has to do with how human beings react to bad experience. So normally we are much more sensitive to a bad experience than a good one, because it's a matter of survival for human beings. So if something is bad, we are much more affected than if someone is good. So also trials are important, but it's important to have trials that provide a good experience if the objective is to try to bring people to use the system. And then the last of the 5 characteristics is observability. And again, this is an interesting topic. I was mentioned before that everybody and everything around us affect how our decision, even if we don't realize. lots of studies in sociology, very famous studies that says people tend to do what other people have done. So we look around and we kind of imitate, for different reasons. There are sociology theory will explain very well what are the reasons. But what is important when we try to measure the demand, especially for innovation, is like people do not decide in isolation. We look around and we see what other people do, and we do try to imitate. This has been proved, but when you try to measure this effect in a model, that's super complicated. It's very, very difficult. But it is something that affects the demand. So going back to our model, we said that this is the first model, and this is has been used a lot. So it's a great model, but has limitation. It's an aggregate model, first of all, and we know there are lots of heterogeneity among people. It assumes that everybody has the same preference, so homogeneity in the market. It's assumed there is only one option, and this option is like prevalent. And also assume that the technology is mature, so there's no change, so people, evaluate the product that is finished. And assume the social network is fully connected, means that everybody's in contact with everybody. And again, this is not the case. We might be in contact with our social network, which is not the entire population. It's like our environment, etc. So nowadays, the most advanced model we're using is not this one anymore, but it's like agent-based models. And I know you are familiar probably with the agent-based model. They have been used in different fields. So agent-based models have the advantage. They require much more powerful computer, much more data. So that's, of course, this is also the reason. I mean, lots of these models, they are not new in the sense that they've been known for many, many years, but there is also a limitation in terms of computational limitation that allows us to use this model much more now than we used in the past. So they are fully disaggregated, really at individual level. They allows interaction among people, so that's very, very the essence of the diffusion. So if you think about the diffusion, it's really a two-way communication. It says that I talk with someone, I exchange an idea, you tell me your impression of if you have used the alternative, and then if you convince me, then I adopt. Otherwise, I don't. So if you use an aggregate model, it's difficult to measure this effect. So the agent-based model allows interaction between agents, and the agents can be individuals or family, but they are a small unit, and so they allow to capture this interaction in a social network much, much better. Agent-based models are being used in both to forecast autonomous vehicles and then to forecast the electric vehicles, etc. If we look at the paper at the moment on autonomous vehicles, their agent-based models are being used mostly to study how the shared autonomous system work. So for an operational level, they assume there is a certain demand, so they assume there is an adoption of the system, a certain number of people using the share, and they try to simulate how these people move, how they can book, for example, the system, how the shared autonomous vehicle operates in the network. There are very few papers on autonomous vehicle ownership, and these papers normally don't use agent-based model. Electric vehicles, there are a little bit more paper on that because, of course, electric vehicles have been there for longer time. And if you look at that literature, we also see agent-based model combined with substitution models, so some discrete choice. Normally very, very simple. I mean, the majority of agent-based model, when there is a decision that agent need to take, they use heuristics. If this happens, yes or no. And then we have a theory that is like the substitution model, behind the substitution model, that allows us to build this model to calculate the probability that someone choose an alternative based on characteristics rather than simple heuristics. But again, to have everything combined is not easy. So most of the agent-based model do not account for both effects. Using the most advanced tools in each of these domains. So What my students, I need to give credit to Christian Domarchi. He is now a postdoc, but he finished PhD students a year ago. And so in his work, what he tried to do is try to combine, to build a model that to forecast the demand of innovation, that tried to combine the most advanced substitution models with social communication, and for that he used a social network. And in social communication, it tries to simulate both direct communication and indirect communication. And in doing that, it was able also to measure how attitude change and preference changes due to the communication with other people. And that's something really important because, as we said, preferences are not stable. Preference change over time. So what's happened is that if we forecast demand for 10 years, we cannot assume that our preference remain the same. But that's difficult. I mean, measure how preference or attitude can change is quite difficult. So he decided he would like to build a model that was a framework that was genetic, could be applied to any kind of innovation, in particular electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles. But at the same time, he applied to electric vehicles because there are two advantages. One is that there is enough market. So he was able to estimate lots of these substitution models using real data. And this, in terms of calibrating the model to real data, is much better. And then he was able to validate the model. Again, another problem. I mean, when we build a model, we don't have real data. We build it based on the theory, which is great, but we have no way to say how close our model reproduces reality, because there's not a reality there. So using electric vehicle allowed him to validate and say, well, at least for the base years, the model reproduces the current situation. And then you have a little bit more confidence, still uncertainty, but a little bit more confidence when you do some forecast. Just briefly, this is the network it built. It used the National Travel Survey in the UK that give data about family in several characteristics, in particular number of people, also income or number of vehicles in the family, etc. And it could locate, physically the family there. And that location is important because you need to build a social network. Again, here you could have asked people about the social network. There are work who have done that. For this dissertation, what he used is homophily network. So he built a network based on people who are similar to the family, and similarity is based on characteristics of the vehicle, the family, and also the geographical location. So those who are physically close to the family, they are more likely to be part of the social network. Again, the homophily network is the most used, but of course there are other theories that can be used, and sometimes people we talk, online, they might be part of our social network because they affect us with the information more than our neighborhood. But still, again, it's an assumption. It's quite realistic. Everything that's happened also in your surrounding the neighborhood, you see them, and then it affects your decision. In terms of substitution, I mean, what he did is try to simulate the decision of buying a vehicle. And that's actually a very important decision in transport. I mean, very often we simulate mode choice, etc., and we forget that the number of vehicle people owns is the starting point. We know that if you have a vehicle, you use it for different reasons, because it's convenient, or because you need to make use of that, because you are paid for that. So you say, well, now I paid, I need to make use, otherwise I waste my money. So we should not forget that everything starts, even if we are interested at operational level, but everything starts from the number of vehicles we own. So it's quite an important decision, sometimes forgotten. But definitely, I mean, in this case in particular, it was trying to simulate the forecast, the EV market, so how many electric vehicles are sold. So of course, you know, the car ownership is the most important decision. So he built models to try to simulate what the decision of whether a family, because normally the car ownership is a family decision. So it's not some, if you are a unit, a family, it's normally something that you decide all together. So whether they decide to add a new vehicle in the family or discharge one, and whether to replace an existing vehicle with an electric vehicle or not. And then if you decide to buy a new vehicle, which type of vehicle you decide to buy. And for this, he estimated, I would say, quite advanced discrete choice models. The first one is the model to whether to add a car or not. And for this one, he used, for example, real data. And the UK is good because they have provide lots of data at national level. So there are this national travel survey where he knows for 8 years all the characteristics of the family and how these characteristics have changed. So, for example, we know that if you, for example, you know, are a family and then suddenly you have a child, then it's very likely that people move, you know, in another neighborhood, maybe from the city center to a more residential, and they buy a car. You know, so if you are in the city center, maybe you don't have children, then you can move around, you know, like with different transport modes. But as soon as your family status change, automatically you also have this. So he tried to model the probability of changing status in terms of number of vehicles in the family, either increasing or decreasing, depending on life events other than other characteristics. This work has been, is not published yet, but it has been presented in a HUB conference a couple of years ago. The second decision is whether to replace a car. Here he decided to use a simple model, a simple probabilistic model. He, again, using real data, he built the distribution of replacement car in the UK. And normally, the average number of years after which people replace the car is kind of 5.68. So based on that, we're using a very simple probabilistic model. So if the family has a car for at least 5 years, the probability to replace that car is higher than, there's a high probability to replace that car. Probably the most interesting model in all this is, of course, the choice of the type of vehicle. And here, for example, it's important to consider both the type of vehicle and the type of engine. There is a correlation between the two, the dimension and the type of engine. So he built a model where he considered both of them, and he also built a latent class model. So he identified 3 classes of people. If people are potential innovator, or skeptics. And then the probability to buy an electric vehicles depend also on the probability to belong to one of these classes. And the probability to buy an electric vehicle depends on the characteristics of the vehicle, but also on attitude. The attitude, I will explain a little bit how we measure that, but these affect the probability to be an innovator or be skeptical, and also the probability to buy an electric vehicle or a normal car. And then there is an extra term that is the willingness to consider, this other term that basically weight reflect the familiarity with an alternative. So weight the probability to buy an electric vehicle. So the more familiar you are with the alternative, the more likely you are to buy it. The less familiar, the less likely you are. The same characteristics, the same attitude, etc., but depending on your familiarity, you are higher or lower probability to buy a car. This paper has been published in Transportation Research Part D. Is already available there. So in terms of social communication, so I will also talk a little bit more about how we measure the attitude. As I said before, I mean, a social communication can be direct
so direct communication between people, and can be indirect because I observe the market. So I don't necessarily interact with anybody specifically, but I observe what's happening. In terms of direct communication, in this case, he had to collect his own data. There were no data available he could use. So what he did is he collected data about attitude twice at a distance of a year. And so he measured attitude first, and then after a year, he contacted the same people. And before asking again about attitude, he provided information. And this information about the electric vehicle could be a positive or a negative information. It could be an emotional information or a rational one. Rational one means like I bought an electric vehicle and I save money, I save time, whatever, I save energy. Emotional is like, oh, I love it, you know, make me feel good and things like that. So, and people can be reached, can change, you know, attitude toward an alternative based on both, because you rationally think about that, or because emotionally you have the experience of being something being good. So we have 4 treatments plus a control group. So basically 5 groups, and each participant was assigned randomly to one of the 5 groups. And then we estimate also models, of course, to measure what is the impact of this kind of information on the change of attitude. The way we measure attitude is new compared to what normally exists in the literature. And he used this theory that is called the hot coherence model. Basically, the model is based on the assumption that people try to maximize the coherence between their needs and the action. So a very simple example is if you feel the need to be sustainable with the environment, this need is coherent with your action to buy an electric vehicle, you know, because it allows you to buy an electric vehicle, it allows you to satisfy your need to be pro-environment. This model is a connectionist network. It's based on the connectionist network. It means that each need is a node, each action is a node, and the link between the nodes and this node between action and needs is the importance of that action in satisfying that need. So again, you have a survey, you collect data, and you build this network. And at the end of the network, you have a set of indicators that measure the attitude or the inclination towards some action and needs, or the emotional evaluation that you give to something. And they use these indicators in the models. Again, this paper is published, if you want to know more, in a journal in Transportation Research Part F. The other form of social influence is like more indirect. As I said, you observe, and this is measured in the willingness to consider parameter or indicator. And again, this is, I don't know if you can see there. I mean, the willingness to consider is a function of the market. So if around you, I mean, in your social network, the market increase, or the number of people in your social network buy electric vehicles, then you have a higher probability to consider that alternative. So if you have already adopted an electric vehicle, so you know everything, the probability is 1, of course. I mean, you have already the vehicle. If nobody around you has a vehicle, the probability is almost 0. If there is someone, I mean, the probability, of course, can vary between 0 and 1. So this is all the components of the model he estimated, and he estimated his model separately, like the discrete choice model or the hot coherence model, and then he put everything together. And then the model, the agent-based model is optimized iteratively. Every year is one period, it can be a month, it depends on the data you have available. In the model, there are, of course, parameters you need to calibrate, and because you use electric vehicle real data, you could calibrate the model. So there are in particular two coefficients that in the willingness to consider equation that need to be calibrated. And to do that, you look at the real data, which is the actual vehicle sold. And so he calibrated these two parameters in a way that the model reproduced exactly the number of vehicles sold as we have from the real market. So again, if you, for example, try to use this model for autonomous vehicle, you don't have a real market, so it's impossible. Even if you want to, you cannot calibrate the model. So the goodness is that if you use a market that is still an innovation, but has some history, so there is some demand, then you can use the information you have about the demand to calibrate the coefficient that are known in the model, and also you can validate the model. How much time I think is gone? Okay, I'm almost finished. So there are a couple of other parameters that you need to, not to calibrate, but to look at the sensitivity. You need to assume some parameter. For example, just to give you an example, is like the social network. What is, the radio of the social network in terms of distance. So again, this is an assumption. You have no idea whether you are influenced by someone living 1 kilometer from you or less. So again, he assumes something, and then he runs some sensitivity test to see how much the results were affected by this assumption. So with this model, it builds, once validated, and so it was sure that it was reproducing the actual market, then it used to forecast the market. So this is like a number, the forecast. I mean, I don't want to spend so much time here, but the basic idea is none of these scenarios allows to reproduce the diffusion that is the target that the UK put themselves for 2030. So in the UK, for example, so by 2030, we need to have 46% of electric vehicles. No way. I mean, there's nothing, even if the most promising scenario, lots of incentives, etc., there's no way to get to that target. So you need to have a combination of measures, you need to be much more aggressive. And even more important, you need to really phase out the selling of normal cars. If you still continue selling normal car, it's very, very difficult to increase the demand, because the current internal combustion vehicles are still very popular. So as long as they are there and available, it will be very, very difficult for the electric vehicle to reach a penetration of the market. That is what normally European governments, but also other governments are aiming for. I want to spend some time, 2 slides only, to talk about autonomous vehicle, but that was the initial title. But at the same time, as I said, when you think about autonomous vehicle, you have no data. So it's very, very difficult. So I thought the experience with electric vehicle was interesting, because the theory is the same. So the same model can be exactly applied if you want to forecast the diffusion of autonomous vehicle as on a car that family owned, okay? The only difference in all this theory is that when you have the model that forecasts the choice of type of vehicle, you can decide whether you want a normal with drive, your steering wheel, or an autonomous vehicle. So in the last there, you have, do you want to buy a new vehicle, a small one, a big one, a SUV, whatever? Do you want to be electric or gasoline, and do you want to be autonomous? Because autonomous vehicle can be electric. I mean, nowadays, actually, this is the direction. So it's exactly the same. Everything I've seen is exactly the same. When we think about shared autonomous vehicle, we might say, well, all this with the shared electric vehicles, autonomous vehicle doesn't apply. Actually, as I was saying before, even if we think about the use of a vehicle, the choice of car ownership is on top of that. So it's not something that we need to assume something. So all the models that look at the operational use of shared autonomous vehicle, they assume a certain demand. So you still need to be correct a model that says what's happened to the ownership. And it is, if you think also about using shared autonomous vehicle, normally if you decide to not to use your own car and to use a shared car, normally this affects also the decision to buy a car. So if you decide to go in that direction, then normally you have also decided not to buy a new car, for example. I mean, it's not that certain, but because you might have a car and you don't use it, but normally, as I said, if you have it, you use it. If you decide to go for public transport or shared vehicles, you normally say, well, why do I need to have an extra car? Because I'm not going to use it, so it's a waste of money. So there is a link between your lower level choice, everyday choice, how to move, and an upper level choice, long-term decision, whether you want to have a car or not. So there is a link, and you still need to run a model to forecast the car ownership before apply any model that is more operational, how you use, which mode you want to use, and then once you decide that instead of public transport or biking or walking, you want to use a shared autonomous vehicle, then you have the operational level. So all the agent-based model at operational level, they assume this decision are there. So to have a full model, you need to model also this upper level decision. First, car ownership, then mode choice, and then once you decide to use a shared autonomous vehicle, then you use an agent-based model to optimize the operational use of the system as a share. So, and even if you think about the mode choice of the operation, you still have an impact of communication of other agents, because you might decide to use a share mode because your friends have used it, because you have heard, you have seen. For example, in China, there are many more people using autonomous taxi because they see it's there, so they can appreciate, and this is why the triability. So, I mean, having tests is important because people see the system used and they are affected in the choice. So, at any level in our decision, whether it is high-level decision, middle term, etc., we are affected by what other people do. So, the theory that our substitution decision in substitution among alternative is affected by the characteristics of the alternative, but also by the communication, direct and indirect, is relevant at any level of our decision process. So to conclude, there are very vast literature about innovation. We know what affect, but when it comes to put everything together, that is more complicated. And as we said, for some innovation, it's impossible to validate. So for some other, like electric vehicle, we reached a stage where we are just in between. It's still in innovation. Lots of the people are not adopting, but we have enough markets to allow us to build a model that was calibrated and validated with real data. Of course, there are lots of assumptions we also made, even in this case. For example, we assume there is only one actor, and we know there are many others. So there are the car dealer, there are the car producer, there are the government. So, I mean, if we run a model without assuming there are some other actors that might put constraint or facilitate something, of course, that's still a limitation in what we do. Every time we want to simulate this problem, we need to remember there are different layers of decision, not only one. So of course, I mean, sometimes we need to make some assumption, and we cannot always run everything, but we need to remember that there is a link between the decision of own a car and the decision we take every day in our life. So actually, sometimes one of the first policy should be like the car ownership, because if we reduce car ownership, then it's easier to move people towards sustainable modes. If we don't reduce car ownership, it's much more complicated because you have there, and it's so easy to use. And so, in practical term, the demand is still, especially for electric vehicle and probably also autonomous vehicle, there is some reluctance in using the system for different reasons. So we need really to put much more effort to try to boost the demand. And as a researcher, definitely now that we have the instrument, it is good to have more research on this field in order also to get improving our ability to forecast demand that remain a very, very challenging task for everything we have set. In the presentation, there is a list of a paper I made reference to, and then with that, many thanks. I'm sorry I'm late.